than ever. Ian Williams, Channel 4 News, Jakarta.
Well, a few moments ago, I spoke to a man who, until very recently, was Indonesia's Environment Minister, Sarwono Kusumaatmadja. And I began by asking him if tomorrow's demonstrations would be a turning point.
Well, we'll have to see from that point on, because the authorities seem to be determined to prevent it from happening.
You have every indication that they will try to stop people gathering in the square?
I believe so, yes.
I mean, are the troops gathering now to try and prevent people arriving?
They are not very obvious about it.
You have been in this government yourself as a minister in the past. Is preventing this kind of demonstration tomorrow partly what the security forces are trained for?
Well, I think in that sense, yeah, you have to give credit for the police to that in the past 2 years they've been using the normal riot controls. In the old days, people would just be shot by automatic guns. But it is elements within the armed forces who are trying to subvert the system and try to spread terror.
How long ago did you understand that President Suharto really had to go?
Well, I made sure that I would not be included in the present government.
So you think he should have stepped down this last time, let alone gone on to serve another term?
Yes, we had hopes that he would make a turnaround leadership in March by forming a credible cabinet, but he failed to deliver on those promises.
And do you have any hope that tomorrow can take place without bloodshed?
It depends on the attitude of Mr. Suharto and Mr. Habibie.
But you are determined that there should be a protest?
Well, it seems that the protest movement is not in a mood to negotiate.
And are they right in that?
Morally, they're right. Whether politically they're right, they don't care. They don't seem to care.
Sarwono Kusumaatmadja, the former Environment Minister, talking to me earlier. Now, at
Carter, his tame politicians have turned against him, and now even the American Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, has urged him to step down as an historic act of statesmanship. Robin Denselow has been taking the pulse of a nation in revolt.
Today was National Awakening Day, celebrating the Indonesian nationalist movement that opposed Dutch colonial rule. Those involved in the new opposition against President Suharto awoke to find that soldiers had blocked off central Jakarta. A demonstration by 1 million people had been planned, and the military vowed to stop it. Meanwhile, over in the middle-class suburb of Cempaka Putih, the banners of the reform lobby blocked the streets. And here, Aldi Garibaldi, a 21-year-old architecture student, was preparing for a potentially dangerous day with the anti-Suharto campaign, and doing so with the approval of his father, a tax inspector working out of town, and his mother.
I am worried about my son.
You're worried about Aldi. And why do you support the students?
Because economic in Indonesia is suffering. The prices is higher and the people can't buy anything.
Aldi was clearly apprehensive of what the day might bring, but argued that his own future career as an architect depended on change.
I don't see my future today because...
You don't have a future?
No, I don't think so, because my major is basically relate with the property business. So in the first place, when the dollar goes up, when the property goes down, so
the rate of the rupiah goes crazy against the dollar.
So the material goes up, and so many architects were fired. So many my senior were fired. So, you know, I don't see much hope in the future for architecture.
He set off to join the campaign and went first to the University of Indonesia campus to get his orders, but found there was some confusion. The million-strong march, organised by Muslim leader Amien Rais, had been called off. The military had warned there could be bloodshed, as in China at Tiananmen Square.
Somebody told me, who happened to be an army general, that he doesn't care at all if Tiananmen accident, accident like Tiananmen will take place today in Jakarta.
So Aldi now set off for Parliament, occupied by students for the past 2 days and the current focal point of the reform movement. Here he found an extraordinary scene. Student groups from all over the country were arriving by the busload. The organisers claimed there were representatives from 250 colleges and universities among the tens of thousands now swamping the complex. There were protesters everywhere, high up on the parliamentary office blocks and on the very top of the parliamentary building itself. And there were students sitting or sleeping, packed into every lobby and corridor. And in the midst of all this, some parliamentary workers were, amazingly, still at their desks. Though in Commission 5, the Secretariat for Energy and Industry, they were playing computer games. Outside, the atmosphere veered between that of a political rally and a pop festival. The military may have threatened possible bloodshed if protesters had tried to rally in the centre of town, but they made no attempt to intervene here, even when President Suharto was insulted in a way never before thought possible during his 32 years in power. There were speeches all day from students and opposition leaders, all demanding that Suharto should resign now and there should be sweeping political, legal and economic change. No one here was impressed by Suharto's address to the nation yesterday. He said there would be elections and that he would resign, but he didn't say when. He said there'd be a reform committee. He will choose the members. Outside Parliament, Aldi and his friends, all architecture students, explained why they wanted the president to step down immediately.
I want to achieve a good government, you know, to Suharto, so he wants to step down and give a chance to younger politicians to step up and make a clean and very honest government.
We want Suharto to step down and ask the representatives to present people's voice, not only some political voice, but people's voice.
At his home across town, Mochtar Buchori, former rector of Muhammadiyah University and now a political writer, explained why he agreed with the students and he was suspicious of the president's address.
I'm convinced that this is a repetition of his old trick to buy time, to outplace opponents, to control the ball and to kick his opponents outside the field.
But he talked of reform, he talked of new elections, he said he'd never stand again. Is that not to be believed, any of that?
There's all beautiful words. But can a true reform be carried out by someone who must be reformed? Because he said that I will lead the reform myself. That's unacceptable. Because he is the cause of the present situation which needs reform. So he must be reformed.
If there is to be real reform and the president is to lose his virtually dictatorial status, then massive changes have to be made, starting with the status of Parliament itself. At present, there's a somewhat bizarre political system. Only 3 parties are allowed, campaigning is severely restricted, all candidates have to be vetted, and the army have a block vote. In other words, the president keeps control. And when it comes to electing or re-electing the president, most of the votes go to his own appointees, not even to Parliament. In his reform speech, Suharto did nothing to explain how that's going to change. And that's an issue that worries Laksamana Sukardi, who runs a political and economic consultancy and advises one of the official opposition parties, the PDI.
The whole political structures need to be changed because the current political structure was designed to preserve the power of the president. And the current system do not allow change in leadership peacefully because there is no independent political party
political party has to be managed and governed by the government, you know, or we can say it's the subordination of government. They pick and choose the leaders. So the majority of members of parliament were picked by Suharto, and there is no independent judiciary system. So the bottom line, there is no control over the government.
Back at Parliament, the students were getting organised. There was plenty of drinking water available, free, and an enormous amount of free food. Helping in the distribution, a well-known Indonesian pop star and a university lecturer who was arrested when her concerned mothers' groups campaigned against the rise of the price of powdered milk. She was delighted by the free food flooding in.
It comes from everywhere, from mothers in Jakarta, in Bogor, from everybody. It's very difficult to say because even children from elementary school, they try to donate their pocket money. That's what we heard this morning.
There may be tens of thousands of students occupying Parliament, but what was happening here should perhaps worry Suharto more. Carload after carload of mostly middle-class Indonesians were arriving to bring food for the students. And it takes a lot to give away food in Indonesia these days. Basic commodities have gone up anything from 20 to 200% in the last 6 months. The middle class are worried by the crisis and many blame Suharto. The students say it's not just their future that's at stake, the present is pretty bad too.
We are an architect student, and if we have to make a model, we cannot afford that because the material were so high, you know. It's from the beginning, it's 300% up.
They live in a strange society. Boom years in the early 90s. Now there are tanks outside McDonald's, and the local currency has lost 70% of its value since August. The massive price rises have added to the unpopularity of the president.
Yeah, many people cannot have the money, don't have the money. Many millions of people are unemployed. They don't have the job, they don't have the education. Education is expensive, hospital is expensive, everything is expensive for the common people.
And who do people blame?
Yeah, many people, like the students, they know this is mismanagement of the power.
Now it's argued the political and economic crises are interlinked. It's too late for IMF measures to matter. It's a crisis of confidence. Suharto must go, or the economy will totally collapse. Tonight there were bleak warnings of a potential food crisis and of how the people would react.
That will cause them first to steal individually, but after that they will do the stealing collectively. After that they will resort to robbery, and after that they will resort to rioting. It is because if they do not do that, they will die of hunger anyway, and dying of hunger is more painful than dying by bullet.
But Suharto is still there after yet another day of protest, though under increasing pressure. There were even reports tonight that he'll resign tomorrow. But the students' campaign continues and the soldiers are still blocking the streets.
That was Robin Denselow in Jakarta. In a moment, will you soon be able to forget about your CV and submit a blood...
The roof of Parliament, as Suharto resigned after 32 years in power. Mark Austin reports from Jakarta.
History will remember this as the day the voice of the people of Indonesia was finally heard. President Suharto has ruled this country for longer than most of these students have been alive. But today, after more than 3 decades, he's gone. This was their revolution, but they say it's not over yet. The nation awoke to an extraordinary national broadcast from the presidential palace.
Saya memutuskan.
In a halting voice and acknowledging he had lost the trust of the country, Suharto begged forgiveness from the people, and then he announced he was standing down. On university campuses across the country, the scene recently of daily protests against Suharto, there was an explosion of joy. The same too in the Parliament complex, occupied by the students for several days now. But the mood was soured by Suharto's last act as president, the handing over of power to his vice president, B.J. Habibie, a close friend of Suharto, handpicked by him for the job, and a man tainted with the same allegations of corruption and cronyism.
Habibie is corrupt, Habibie is part of Suharto's regime, Habibie is not for the people.
So nothing has changed?
Nothing.
He's, how do you call it, a puppet, puppet. A puppet of Suharto. So what's the difference then?
These students are celebrating today because they played a large part in the downfall of a dictator. But even if Suharto has gone, their fear is that his regime lives on.
Suharto's downfall comes after the worst social unrest for years, caused by a deepening economic crisis and resentment at a ruling family with billionaire children accused of plundering the nation's wealth. Some Indonesians want to put Suharto on trial, but today a top army general vowed to protect he and his family, who this evening left the palace, evicted by their own people, a humiliating end for a father of the nation who came to be despised. Mark Austin, ITN, Jakarta.
And a few minutes ago, I spoke to Mark Austin in Jakarta. Mark, we've seen Jakarta. What's happening in the rest of the country?
Well, you've seen the Parliament complex in Jakarta, where there was great celebration, but I have to say that on the streets of Jakarta and in the rest of the country, there's been no real outpouring of joy. It's almost as if there's a stunned disbelief that this man who's ruled the country here for 30 years, dominated people's lives, has suddenly gone.
Well, now, can the new man, who is Suharto's man, win over the people?
Well, he's got an awful lot to prove. He clearly doesn't have the trust of the country. What he's got to do is prove that he's his own man and not Suharto's clone. He's got to push through these democratic reforms as quickly as possible. People are simply fed up with the system of electing a president where 1,000 people choose the president. They want free and fair democratic elections, and if they don't get that, then the protests that have been building up over the last few months, the momentum will start to build up again.
Thank you, Mark.
Country, the $80 billion of debt, the enormous degree of incompetence and corruption in the system. The new president, President Habibie, has so many links with that past that it's going to be difficult to see him as being anything more than a stopgap, and his own family is indeed involved in just the same kind of way that President Suharto was. So the rebellion may well continue.
If he really has gone after 32 years in power, he's going to leave a vacuum. Who or what is going to fill that vacuum?
Well, tomorrow morning he's going to announce his cabinet, and that will certainly show whether he's prepared to bring people from the opposition, the old opposition, into government, the kind of people who don't have the bad record that Suharto's cronies had, who can actually get down to the job of cleaning up the place. That's going to be one very important aspect of it. They, in turn, may well create the kind of system which will produce a new president within much less than the 5 years that President Habibie has given himself. But there's another vacuum which is really important, which one mustn't forget. It's only a week since it was really dangerous in this country to say things like President Suharto is corrupt. You could be arrested, you could be tortured, you could disappear forever for saying that. It's only been a week since people have been able to speak their minds. That really isn't a very long time to base a new society on.
Ended in Indonesia today, but it has not been replaced by democracy. One of the world's most populous nations toppled one of the world's longest-lasting rulers, but the man who's replaced him is just a crony of the old autocrat. Can there really be any change while he's in charge, and how long will the protest movement give him? The Nobel Peace Prize winner, Jose Ramos-Horta, tells us it's now time for Indonesia to bring Suharto to justice. Good news. Indonesia has a civilian government for the first time in its history. And now, after that, of course, the bad news. The new president is President Suharto's crony and deputy, Yusuf Habibie, a man deeply implicated in the corruption of Suharto's regime. But it's the end of 32 years of one-man rule, and the question now is how to meet the hopes his departure has raised. Robin Denselow reports from Jakarta.
Jubilation in Jakarta. The students who've occupied the Indonesian parliament for the past 3 days learned that the first phase of their campaign has succeeded. After 32 years, President Suharto has been forced to resign. Not only the students were celebrating, this woman brought her mother and aunt along.
This is the happiest day in my life.
The happiest day in your life.
I think our dreams come true.
It had all happened rapidly, unexpectedly. Only 2 days ago, Suharto had announced he was staying on and had the army behind him. Now the dictator, whose family are worth some $30 billion, was actually stepping down and apologizing. handing over to Vice President B.J. Habibie, a 61-year-old scientist whom Suharto suggested should stay on until 2003, despite the reform campaign's demand for early elections. Out on the streets, the reaction was extraordinary. Soldiers who only yesterday had threatened to shoot reform lobby demonstrators were now carrying flowers, while the tank crews in the city centre were suddenly popular.
So everything has changed, or has it? Jakarta has been celebrating, but the man who's taken over was the Vice President and one of Suharto's oldest friends and closest allies. In other words, one of the ex-presidential cronies. Now B.J. Habibie heads the world's fourth most populous nation, a nation that's still in crisis.
He's an unusual contender for the job. He's been guided by the former president since he was at school, when he met Suharto, who'd been sent to his province as a soldier. Habibie studied aircraft design in Germany and back in Indonesia became technology minister, trying to propel the country into the high-tech era. He headed a batch of companies, including one that built aircraft. And he founded ICMI, an influential society of Muslim intellectuals whose members are groomed for success and leadership. In March, when Habibie became Indonesian vice president, he handed over his ICMI role to Achmad Tirto Sudiro. In an exclusive Newsnight interview tonight, Achmad discussed his friend, the new president, and the role that he himself had played in persuading Suharto to quit this morning.
You've been involved in trying to persuade him to resign.
Yes.
Was that hard to do? Was it hard to persuade the president to
resign?
Well,
I have not done it personally.
No, but you were consulted, I'm sure, as part of that.
Indeed. I like him very much personally, and he is a nice man, actually, but I think he has been too long president.
What was the argument that you really used to persuade Suharto to leave?
Well, first of all, the economic condition is so bad. We have never been so bad, and we did not believe that we are in this condition, this kind of condition. Such a beautiful country with so many natural resources that we can be this poor, this bad, unbelievable.
But it still took some time to persuade him to leave, though.
Yes. Well, you know, we started when he was in Egypt, in Cairo, and he said, it's not a problem that I have to step down.
Just over a week ago?
Yes, that we made use of this statement. And we said, we made a statement, and I called all the branches of the ICMI here, and we made a statement that we welcome the idea of stepping down of President Suharto. And it keeps rolling until he resigned today.
What was the final argument then that persuaded President Suharto that he ought to leave? Why did he finally go?
Last night, many ministers came to him and said, we resign.
Ministers resigned last night?
Yes, many ministers resigned, and there was a strong indication that many ministers will follow. So maybe he think, well, even my closest associates start leaving me, so it's better to resign.
At Ahmed's home, he has pictures of himself with Suharto taken 31 years ago, and several of himself with his friend President Habibie, who he's known for 25 years. So, would Habibie have a different style as president?
He will have a more democratic approach to parliament, to the parties, to the society. He will be more, as he promised, to be more open.
Back at the occupied parliament, the new president is not seen in the same light. The demonstrators are delighted that Suharto is gone, but they don't want Habibie to stay around for long. They want reform, free, fair elections to be held soon, and measures to end the economic crisis that led to Suharto's demise. The students here are not convinced that Habibie is the man for the job.
I don't think that he's a good politician. Maybe he's a very clever scientist, but he's not a good politician.
Personally, I don't like him.
Why not?
Because I think his point of view about the Indonesian economics is too too further in the future. And I don't think that his economic policies and his economic point of view about Indonesia is applicable for the current situation here in Indonesia.
Amien Rais, the Muslim leader who's emerged as the leading spokesman of the reform movement, wanted to see who's in Habibie's cabinet before endorsing him.
But if he makes the same mistake as Suharto and then less than 1 month he will collapse too, you know. So it depends very much on what kind of cabinet, what is the nature of the cabinet he is going to give us to the Indonesian people.
There's caution too from the business community struggling with a collapsed economy. The ailing local currency, the rupiah, rallied a little when Habibie took over, but he's warned not to stay too long.
There was indication given this morning when Suharto resigned that he was expecting Habibie to be in place until the end of this natural term. The outside world would definitely not be in favour of that, and so we're hoping, I think, for some signal that that is not the case this evening.
So if he tries to suggest you'll be here till 2003, that'll be very bad news indeed.
That will be taken very negatively by the market.
Indonesians are keen for change to continue with Suharto gone. So will President Habibie agree to reform and early elections or try to stay on? Even his close ally didn't seem completely sure.
Well, he is not that ambitious, I think. And I think he is realistic enough. If there are conditions which are prevailing to have general election, I think he will abide to it.
You think he won't try to stay on?
No, let's say, if within 6 months he is excellent, and the people said, well, why don't we continue? I don't think he will have objections. But if there will be general elections, I don't think he will object also.
So it could go either way?
Correct, correct.
Sehingga kita tabah.
Tonight, President Habibie addressed the nation on television. He talked of reform, enhanced democracy and tackling corruption. But those who've been campaigning for reform were disappointed. He didn't say when there would be elections, who would be in his new cabinet, or how he'd tackle the economic crisis.
I expected him to mention a certain date. When is the election going to be conducted? The general election going to be conducted?
So, really then, as far as you're concerned, is there any difference tonight between him and Suharto yesterday?
No. There's just a repetition of the rhetorics of Suharto.
Are you happy that he is the new president?
No.
Why not?
I don't believe in him because he is too close to Suharto.
Today there was new military protection outside President Habibie's home. But Suharto's old friend must now show he really is different. He too could be swept away if he doesn't agree to reform.
Well, a little while ago I spoke to Jose Ramos-Horta, who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his work defending the East Timorese. I asked him if the new president was likely to be radically different from his predecessor.
It's highly unlikely. Besides Habibie, with all respect to him as a human being, he is not a true leader, he is not a statesman. He was too glued to the Suharto family from childhood. He is part and parcel of what brought down Indonesian economy. So I don't believe that he would go that far to betray Suharto by dismantling the Suharto empire, his business empire. So the choice of Habibie as president was already a very bad one. We remember that in December, when his name was first mentioned as Suharto's vice presidential candidate, the rupiah shot down from 10,000 to the dollar to 17,000 within a few hours. So I don't believe he has international credibility of the financial institutions, and Indonesia badly needs new investments in the amount of billions of dollars to get out of this social, economic and political crisis.
There is a problem, of course, with the opposition being so fragmented and having no figure around whom they can coalesce. But let's suppose that Mr. Habibie does not make the changes which you believe he needs to make and needs to make urgently, what do you believe will happen?
I believe that you would have millions of people back in the streets, and the army will have no choice but to side with the people. The army usually fires on small crowds. If there are only 500 or 1,000, 5,000 people in the streets, they would shoot to kill. But when you have 500,000, 1 million people, the army joins them. Then you might have a reformist officer of the younger generation, trained by the Americans over the years. He might be the one who would emerge as a transition leader, and behind whom you would have people like Megawati Soekarno-Putri, Amien Rais, the students, supporting until elections are held in Indonesia.
Well, given that Suharto has now been toppled, what do you think ought to happen to him? I mean, there are many people who think that this man either actively encouraged or at the very least condoned some very terrible things that